Hi, everyone. My name is Brit Hartley. I'm an atheist spiritual director, and I talk a lot about nihilism and nihilism recovery. And today we're going to talk about how nihilism as a term, how that term is used by psychologists and how it's used by philosophers, because this came up this past week in a TikTok conversation that I had with Dr. Angelica Scheel, who is a clinical psychologist. And we went back and forth a little bit. And by the end, I feel like I understood a little bit more about how psychologists use this term and how they're meaning this term in their training and education, and then how philosophers use it, because anytime that like violence or depression is part of the conversation, this word nihilism gets thrown around. And so I think this term is getting very muddled because it is different how it's used philosophically versus how it's used by psychologists and also therapists. So let's take a look at a video of a psychologist explaining nihilism.
So on an individual level, I see what absolutely kills people, what justifies self-death, or even justifies going around squishing others, your kids, your partner, your neighbor online. And this life killer is a psychological state of nihilism. Super depressed people get there one of two ways: anxious burnout that detaches and isolates and gets us thinking, what's the point? Or hopelessness that comes from seeing shitty reality without any access to purpose or love. The first one is the typical depressed person I see in therapy, and the second one doesn't usually go to therapy, probably swings more men or neurodivergent, but it's the one that I have to guard my own mind against whenever I'm in my most high analysis state. So nihilism is a what's the point? What's the point of trying? What's the point of connecting, of enduring the disappointment, the alone despair of loving in a loveless world? If that sounds too cheesy, sorry, it's true. And this nihilistic mindset can infect the trifecta of the three extreme ideologies, all three of them. Psychopathically morally depraved, the absolute left who says, I justify condemnation if you have rules, and the absolute right who say, I justify condemnation if you deny rules and guardrails. The morally depraved say, there's no connection or love, only winning the game, getting more money, getting more dominance, more power. Winning the game justifies evil. The absolute left say, humans are so evil and hateful.
So I got tagged a lot in that video, and there were a lot of comments about how this didn't resonate with people. So there were nihilists who said, hey, I am philosophically nihilistic. That does not mean that I am the world's greatest problem or that I'm violent. And some people were very hurt when she talked about how she had to guard her mind against some forms of nihilism, because for people who have gone to therapy for existential depression, existential questions, nihilistic thoughts, they can sense that wall between them and their therapist, that their therapist or their psychiatrist doesn't understand the validity of their arguments, and they have their own wall in between them because of their own fear of the void. And so it brought up a lot of hurt feelings in this psychologist's content. And so when she talked about nihilism, what she's meaning is a state of mind, a symptom. She's meaning the state of mind of burnout or hopelessness. And so for her, these are like the main causes of severe depression of people that she's coming, people that are coming into her office. She's seeing nihilism just as this is a psychological state of hopelessness, and it comes from burnout or just looking out into the world and being convinced that it is hopeless. So in psychology, nihilism is less about defending an argument like there are no objective morals or there's no objective truth. And it's more about describing what it feels like when someone can't find meaning or believes nothing matters to them personally. But philosophically, nihilism is way different. It's not really about a state of mind at all, because there are optimistic nihilists, for example, in philosophy, who are absolutely thriving in life. And so nihilism in philosophy is a claim about the world. It's a claim about the objective reality, that there is no inherent meaning in the universe, that we are here, we don't know why, there isn't objective morals or objective truth or some kind of grand narrative or story or purpose. There's no inherent meaning. We don't know why we're here. The universe doesn't give us meaning. That's what nihilism is. So in the comment section, when optimistic nihilists were like, I'm nihilistic and I built meaning in my life and I'm not violent and I'm living a great life because I've created my own meaning and purpose, she would say that's not nihilism, because to a psychologist, if you are thriving, that is not the mental state of nihilism. So it's almost more like a quadrant. I should probably draw this, but I don't I don't know how to do that. So I'm just going to go like this. It's like a quadrant. You can be low or high in philosophical nihilism, like your belief about the universe being meaningless. And you can be low to high in the psychological state of nihilism. And I know and work with people all over that map. Some are philosophically nihilistic, but they are thriving in life. They aren't depressed. They have no real need for therapy. Some are unaware of philosophical nihilism and have been depressed for so long that their brain can only feel hopeless. And so they're just living in the state of nihilism, but their spirals, their neuroticism doesn't have a lot of philosophical arguments. It's really just that I'm hopeless, I'm depressed. And then there's everywhere in between. And so there are more than just two ways to a nihilistic philosophy. For her, in her experience, she's experiencing just mostly people who see the problems in the world or burnout. But for nihilistic philosophy, there's a lot more ways. So there is hopelessness and burnout for sure. There's also sensitivity to suffering. There's trauma. There's neurodiversity, especially being on the autistic spectrum. When I'm working with nihilists, which I'm not doing this year because I'm training a cohort, but when towards the end of last year, when I was seeing a lot of nihilistic clients, I was having, I don't know, maybe 30% or somewhere on the spectrum because of that highly analytical thinking. And then there's philosophy in general as a field of study that can make you nihilistic because you start to break down all these concepts. There's postmodern deconstruction. There's faith deconstruction where you lose all your anchors at once when God dies for you. That's what happened to me. There are lots of ways to philosophical nihilism. And so the gap that is so often happening in therapy is that therapists treat nihilism as a psychological state that needs to be fixed. But if a person is philosophically nihilistic, then there's a mismatch. And so later on in her video, she talks about increasing joy. And I'm in a place now where that's great. What are the ways that a therapist can help you increase joy? But here's the thing, that would not have helped me in the depths of my philosophical nihilism, because you need a reason that trying to have a life that is more joyful is good. And people who are not philosophically nihilistic will not even understand the sentence that I just said. They'll not understand why joy is sometimes, how could joy not be good? So stay with me on this one. If I'm a philosophical nihilist and there's no inherent meaning in the universe, then we are just products of evolution. And joy is just chemicals that your brain gives you when you do what evolution wants you to do. And so even the path of joy is suspect because you can't yet call that good. You don't have a framing for it yet. You don't have a narrative for it yet. Because if evolution is a machine that says survive and reproduce at all costs, and that is good, run from the lion, and I'm going to give you this little dopamine hit, or run at the gym because your body doesn't know the difference. And so here's a little dopamine hit for that. And if evolution is just this violent machine where you have to consume conscious life to live, then how can you say that pursuing joy is good when you're just doing what evolution wants you to do? And is evolution even good because it seems to be a violent machine that just says survive and reproduce at all costs? And so the question of whether or not it's ethical to be moral, or whether or not there's objective truth, or whether or not there's objective reality, or is it even worth it to create meaning? Because are you just forcing yourself to live under an illusion? There were so many people in my comment section that said something like that when I was responding to this video. They would say things like, being in therapy felt like I could tell my therapist didn't like me and didn't like to work with me. And I felt like I was trying to brainwash and gaslight myself to care, but I just don't see the point. And there were hundreds of comments that were like this, where they experienced like a wall between them and their therapist. And they experienced like they were trying to brainwash and gaslight themselves into caring and increasing joy, but they just couldn't get themselves to that point because fundamentally there's a philosophical gap there that why should I care? Actually, why should I care? And this is the reason that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, statistically does so poorly against philosophical nihilism, because with cognitive behavioral therapy, your therapist is seeing your hopelessness as just a negative frame of mind that you can just reframe. So let's reframe the negative and try to make it positive. So you try to focus on the positive and you do things like a gratitude journal. But we know from statistics that this does nothing for philosophical nihilism. If anything, it can make it worse. If you list out all your privilege while you realize that most people don't have these things, that makes you more likely as a nihilist to want to push the big red button to end all life on Earth and end this project as unethical altogether. Because it doesn't make you feel good that you have a lot more privilege that most people don't have. That actually makes it worse. And so here are some of the core like snags that we run into if you're working with a nihilist. So the first one is if joy, it's what I said before, but I want to like list this out because these are the things that we consistently run into. If joy is just a neurochemical reward shaped by evolution, then recommending joy to a client telling the client to submit to some blind optimization process, survive, reproduce, which is not something that you could say is good. And so they're not going to really get involved with that because you haven't given them a reason that joy is actually good. Number two, if objective value is false, then all shoulds are manipulative. This is like the is ought problem. So like, okay, my life will be less suffering if I do this. But if we don't have any sense of objective morals or objective value, then why should I do anything? I'm just going to die and this planet is just going to blow up and nobody's going to care that we're here. What do you mean I should? What do you mean I should be a good person? Like why? That's going to be a problem. Number three, if the client worries, the client will worry about meaning making being a self-deception. So anything from a therapist that's like fake it till you make it is going to make it worse for the client because they're going to feel fundamentally broken. And so meaning making has to be more than just reframing. Otherwise, it's received as trying to be self-deceptive and trying to gaslight yourself. Number four, if minimizing, this is a tough one. This is rational. This is where you get rational nihilism, which is really hard for therapists to work with. I'll get calls from therapists asking about this particular client. If minimizing suffering is the only aim, like we're just going to minimize suffering, that's our goal, then you can conclude that non-existence is best, because this is when we encounter not just like depressed reasons for suicidality, but rational reasons for suicidality, which are much different. They require a different set of skills. And often it's very scary to deal with this as a therapist, because it's not coming from a place of depression. It's coming from a place of, if minimizing suffering is the greatest good, then not living is better than living. And then even you can have a rational argument for suicide. You can even have an irrational argument for either ending all life or at least ending all human life. And this can come from a place, especially that highly analytical group, that philosophical group, the autism, if part of the autism is being highly analytical, then you'll start to get rational reasons that concludes that non-existence is best. This is not just like a psychological state of nihilism where you feel depressed. This is you need a philosophical reason to be alive, which requires philosophy, which most therapists don't have. And that is a big gap that I'm seeing. Number five, if agency is illusory, if we don't have free will, choose differently is incoherent. So a lot of this, if you're a nihilist, you're more likely to believe that we don't have free will. Nihilists have very few anchors. The self is an illusion, free will is an illusion, our stories are an illusion, religion is an illusion. It's the ultimate kind of like, it's described as like being outside of the matrix, because you realize all of these anchors we just hold to psychologically, but they're just like trying to hold on to sand. And so a therapist saying like, choose to be happy or choose differently, like that can't land anywhere. There's no anchor for that. So if the therapist believes in free will, especially if the therapist is religious, they're trying their best to give you good advice for reframing, but you don't have any philosophical foundation for that advice to land anywhere. Number six is value is authored. Why not just author solipsism, which is, I know that I exist, but I don't know if you exist. Why not just be selfish and live like a hedonist? If you can just choose your own values that make life worth living, and nobody cares, and there's no objective values, there's no objective morality, then I just choose that being a selfish person and living the most greedy life that I enjoy personally is my reason for living. And what's wrong with that? you have to combat that philosophically. So these are questions that are difficult for therapists, not because they're dumb, not because therapists are dumb. I'm not like dissing therapy. I've gone to therapists for different reasons, not this specific reason. Um, they're not dumb. They're just trained in certain things and certain symptoms and certain approaches, and they are not philosophers. And if they've never been in the void, if they've never been anchorless, especially if they are religious, then this just isn't their field of expertise, and we shouldn't expect them to. We should not expect psychologists to be philosophers because they are not. But in the US, we just hear go to therapy, right? Like if you have a problem, go to therapy. And the interesting thing is that in the UK, where they are further along in their secularism than we are, they have philosophical counselors because of this gap. And we literally cannot handle that in the US because, like, my favorite example is we couldn't even handle Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which is what it's called in the UK. We had to call it Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone because we trust sorcerers and we are less scared of sorcerers than we are scared of philosophers. Like, we are far too religious of a country, and we are very distrustful of philosophy in general. And so the UK has already developed something for this gap that the US has not caught up on. And so we have this, like, people are falling through the cracks where they need something to address philosophical nihilism, and they are only getting help for the psychological state of hopelessness, but not these really deep questions about whether it's even ethical to be alive. So beginning in the late 1980s, 1990s, the UK kind of built this ecosystem that explicitly unites philosophy with therapy. And they founded the Society for Existential Analysis, the SEA, and its journal, Existential Analysis. And they launched a postgraduate training and later the New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling in London. And these programs teach therapists how to treat meaning and value and mortality and morality and ethics as philosophical concerns rather than just cognitive distortions. And so existential therapists are clinically trained, but work philosophically. So a client can say, I'm an existential or even optimistic nihilist, and not be steered straight into reframing drills because the therapist has had enough training in philosophy to be able to work within their philosophical worldview. Because if psychologists treat nihilism purely as a symptom of a pathology, but the client experiences it as a legitimate rational worldview that there is no inherent meaning in the universe, then therapy becomes alienating rather than healing, and there is a potential to do a lot more harm. For me personally, I never met a therapist that was able to help me with philosophical nihilism. I never met a therapist who had been or experienced the void. I came out feeling more broken, and it made me feel like if everybody's answer in the United States is go to therapy, and I went to therapy, I probably tried 3 or 4 different therapists. Again, I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't have this language, but I went to therapy 3 or 4 times, and it just didn't, like, they didn't understand me. They didn't understand the questions that I was spiraling about. They just kept trying to, reframe me to be more optimistic. Then I actually left that experience feeling like everybody tells me to go to therapy. It doesn't work. Therefore, nothing will work. Therefore, I'm fundamentally broken, or everybody else doesn't see it and there's nothing that can help me. And it was very depressing to kind of have therapy fail for me from a personal point of view. The last thing that I want to discuss from her video is separating accelerationism from nihilism. So she really kind of lumped violence with nihilism in a way that I think is really unfair. So nihilism, it's a verdict about value or meaning. It's saying there's no inherent meaning, no objective moral truth, and sometimes no reason to privilege human flourishing unless it's kind of mixed with something else philosophically. So it can be calm, it can be curious, it can be joyful, it can be bleak or paralyzing. A lot of that depends on your personality. But accelerationism is a strategy about change dynamics. It's different than nihilism. It claims that speeding up technology advances, economic, social processes will break the current order and yield a new one. So it cannot be described as a nihilistic philosophy because there is a goal. If you're pushing towards societal collapse on the left, on the political left, so that we can rebuild a post-capitalistic society because we can't fix what we have without tearing it down, yes, that is violent. Yes, that can be like blowing shit up. But there is a goal in mind that the world world would be better if this, right? Or on the political right, it can look like wanting more destruction in the Middle East as an accelerant to bring about the end of the world so that Jesus will come. And neither are inherently nihilistic, because it's destruction towards a goal that the world should be better in some fundamental way. It should be different. And that's kind of an ultimate claim about reality, that the world should be different than what it is. And nihilists don't usually subscribe to that, because there is no objective meaning. There's only subjective meaning. There is no, the world should have been X. There is just this, and it has no objective inherent meaning. Now, there is a small subtype of accelerationism called nihilistic accelerationism. And this is where you do kind of value the collapse, but with no sense of rebuilding. This is like the Joker, right? Someone who just wants to watch the world burn for no reason at all. So like if nothing matters, then speeding up the crash of humanity can feel permitted or even amusing. Online, this shows up as like fatalistic memes and calls to make things worse or do crimes or let it all burn. But it is quite rare, because violence usually tends to be for a reason more than there's no reason for anything at all. Even just look at like homicide. Like, you're more likely to be murdered because it's someone you know or because of some conflict than to be murdered by someone who has literally no reason to at all. It's much more rare because it's just not as emotionally charged. If you're truly nihilistic, you tend to just be on the couch collapsed because you have no reason to do anything. So there's no reason to like blow up the world, because like, what is the point of that? Like, you usually have to have a reason to do things. And so while there are circumstances where you get a Joker type character where you have nihilistic accelerationism for no reason at all, just burn it all down. It is so rare, especially compared to the political violence that we get specifically on the political right, and the acceleration that we get from the political right. So this nihilism term gets thrown around anytime there's violence, but it's a bit unfair to the philosophical stance of nihilism. And when we see the worst of nihilism, it tends to be not others violent. It tends to be just like the self shutting down because you have no reason to do anything. And so, nihilism, I'd be much more concerned with self-harm or things like slow suicide or addiction than I would be about some mass shooter being truly nihilistic. Like that is much more. Most documented accelerationism in the wild is overtly political. It's the far right in particular, with some leftist variants. So Dr. Shields using nihilism to say that this is violent, it's the biggest problem, it leads to harming the self and harming others. And then she's talking about the violence of the left and the right. How she was describing that doesn't kind of square with how nihilism is used as a philosophy, which usually does not lead to others' harm. Very rarely does it lead to harm of others, but it can lead to a kind of depression that is self-annihilating. So online, this looks like no lives matter as a kind of meme that gets passed around, and it's like chaos for chaos sake. It has no end goal or purpose to it. And yes, that can be dangerous, but it's just so rare compared to the violence specifically of the political right. So stay tuned, because I want to explore this concept more, because I get a sense that there's a lot of people who are struggling to find the right combination of therapy for the psychological issues that you have and also the philosophical help that you need. So I want to do a part 2 where I'm going to weave in philosophical nihilism help with psychological nihilism help, so that you can be more skilled in saying, oh, this is where I am. These are the specific resources that I need, rather than just go to therapy. Because if therapy isn't working for you, then it's, we want to have you build from the right starting point for you. So, to this day, never found a therapist that helped me with philosophical nihilism. Philosophers helped me in that space. But then a lot of the philosophers didn't help me with other aspects. Like, none of the philosophers who talk about nihilism were active parents like I am. Like, I am the default parent. And so, like, if you ask Albert Camus, how do you do parenting when you're a nihilist? He was an absent parent. He just like traveled the world writing with his, having all kinds of affairs, and he was not an active parent at all. So there are many things that like I still use therapy for. And there are things that I know that this is a philosophical issue, and now I know the resources for that space. And so I always felt misunderstood with therapists. I feel like they just treated me like I had blue colored glasses on that I could just change to pink colored glasses, and it didn't work. And I know that there are existential therapists who are trained in this, like that they exist, like you guys for sure exist. I didn't know that at the time, but I know that exists. It's a highly specialized field, and I didn't have the language yet to know that what I was looking for. All I knew was that I was suicidal and I couldn't think of any reason to live. And when I got philosophical help and I could bridge that gap and not be considered crazy for my dark thoughts because they felt really rational to me, then I could get to the point where therapy could help me and I could build from there. And so stay tuned, because next time I'm going to do a part 2 about how to bridge that gap so that you are, for you, appropriately getting philosophical help and psychological help, so that together that can start helping to move you forward, which they're already doing in European countries and already have foundations and therapists doing that. And we haven't quite caught up yet. And then hopefully that will help you verbalize what you need from your therapist. I know that there are people who use my videos to send to their therapist to help give their therapist language for how they're feeling. And so I want you to be able to walk into therapy and say, I'm not asking for reframing. I need meaning-centered or existential work or logotherapy. Or please avoid using moral realism with me because I prefer constructionist language. Or I'm open to experiments, not affirmations. Or I'm not resonating with this find joy, choose happiness, you should kind of stuff, because that doesn't fit my philosophy of how I see the world. Here's language that resonates with me more. That way you have the tools and resources to bridge the gap left behind from traditional therapy. And then if you're working with a therapist, you can be part of that conversation more about language and education into what is helpful and what isn't, so that you can be a better client for your therapist, to know what your therapist is wanting from you. And then I'll also do a part 3, which is going to be what to do when this nihilistic person is a teenager or a young person, because that also requires a different approach. They don't have a strong sense of self yet to build on. So much of the advice for nihilism is you need to know your core values, and you need to live authentically, and you need to live according to your own moral code. And if you don't have a self built yet, especially if you have high anxiety, if you are anxious, if you are LGBTQ, you don't feel like you accept yourself yet, you don't even know who you are, then now not only do we have like a philosophy gap, we have to build a self, have some philosophical help, and have some psychological help. So for teenagers in nihilism, there's even more steps that we have to consider. When a teenager is like, I don't see the purpose of living. Like, I don't get that there's a meaning of being alive. And so we actually have to go back to helping them build a self so that we have a foundation to build on to even address their philosophical nihilism, which is another added step. And then I think I'll do a part 4, because today was just posted a conversation with Alex O'Connor and Dr. K and a Christian apologist, and it was on the Diary of a CEO podcast, where they talked about the meaning crisis. And they talked about all the statistics about what's going on with the meaning crisis. You should go look at it. I'll review it as part of this series that I'm doing. But they talked about all the statistics that 9 out of 10 young people in the UK are struggling with meaninglessness, how some of them are going back to religion, how young men especially are struggling with it more than young women. And essentially all of them in the room agree, we have a problem. We have a problem. When we lost these religious stories, something happened. Like the foundation of what we were doing kind of bottomed out. And now most young people just have a sense of like, what is the point of this? And then you get the argument. This is a 3.5-hour podcast. It was absolutely fascinating, because, this is my field, so it's going to be fascinating to me. But it's fascinating that they kind of represented all of the options. So Alex O'Connor kind of had a more atheistic stance of we can build meaning, and the Christian apologist was like, we got to go back to religion. And then of course the other Alex O'Connor got all debatey and said, we can't go back to these old truth claims that don't make sense because that's making it worse. And then we had Dr. K, who I'm learning more about him. I'm recently familiar to his work, but he does a lot of secular spirituality like me, science driven spirituality. And he was showing the statistics of, hey, we can get all the benefits of this religion and not have to believe in this Adam and Eve story if we can get people more access to spirituality in a secular way. And he has his own program where like 1,500 people went through his program that kind of combined therapy with spirituality. And it was like 70% said, by the end that they had a good sense of their meaning and purpose in life, which is pretty good statistically. Anyway, and so there was just a lot of options being represented at that table that was representative of the broader conversation of what's going on in the meaning crisis. So I'm going to cover that as well. So I hope this was interesting to you. Please ask any questions in the comments, because I'm going to stay here for at least a couple of weeks, because I'm just noticing that this is a huge gap, especially in American therapy, addressing philosophical nihilism versus psychological nihilism. So I hope that was interesting to you. Would love to read your comments because I want to explore this concept a lot more. All right. See you guys.